right, I think we can get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the online open house for the First Avenue North reconstruction project. I know people are still coming in. It's really great to see so many of you joining the open house today. It is a rather cold and snowy evening. Today's open house is an important milestone for the project, and we really appreciate you all being here. As a reminder, this open house is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be posted to the project webpage. All right, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Leoma Van Dort, and I am a transportation planner with Minneapolis Public Works. Presenting with me today is project manager Luke Hansen. Luke is a senior transportation planner with Minneapolis Public Works. Also joining us from the project team is project engineer Membera Wadajo, who is a senior professional engineer also with Minneapolis Public Works. Some meeting logistics before we kick off the presentation. We will use the first 30 minutes or so to walk you through some slides. That'll include an overview of the project, a recap of the engagement and technical work we've done, and then we'll get into some key considerations that inform the proposed design. We will also share with you some important next steps for the project and use the remainder of the time to respond to any questions or comments that you may have. You can use the Q&A feature, which you will see at the top of your screen, to submit your questions to the project team. The Q&A feature isn't open just yet, but we will open it towards the end of the presentation. And with that, let's jump into a quick project overview. So this is a full reconstruction of about half a mile of First Avenue North between Washington Avenue and 8th Street. This segment of the corridor was last constructed in the early 90s, and we have some aging infrastructure over there that need replacing. This corridor is identified as a high injury street in the city's Vision Zero action plan and is part of the city's pedestrian priority network. So this project, this reconstruction, really gives us the opportunity to upgrade pedestrian facilities and improve safety. Currently, the project is slated for construction in 2028 and 2029. The total project cost is $28 million that will be funded by a $2 million federal grant. This grant is for improving pedestrian facilities along First Avenue. Additionally, we will also use bonds, special assessments, and municipal state aid funds to cover the remaining cost of the project. So the yellow star that you see on the timeline graphic here shows where we are today. And this is an exciting point in the project. It concludes almost 2 years of work, both on the technical side and in collaboration with the public and our project stakeholders. We kicked off the project in late 2023, and throughout last year and this year, we completed 3 phases of engagement. And this is part of a 4-phase engagement plan. So we are now in the 4th and final phase of engagement. And today we are sharing our preferred layout with all of you ahead of bringing it to City Council for layout approval early next year. So this then brings us to the next step of more detailed final design that will happen all of next year through 2027. And then construction will begin in 2028 and 2029. I'll not read out all the words on the slide here, but I do want to highlight the project vision and goals. This project vision and the 6 goals that you see on the slide here were a direct outcome of our first phase of engagement. So in our first round of engagement, we asked the public and our stakeholders about their experience on First Avenue today and what their vision was for a future First Avenue. And the feedback we received was essentially what we developed into our project goals and vision, which includes a pedestrian-focused street with amenities for people walking and rolling, a street that provides people access to many destinations on First Avenue, greening and pedestrian-friendly features, and a street that is able to support nightlife and event operations that ultimately enhance the neighborhood identity. As I previously mentioned, we've done public engagement for nearly 2 years. We talked to people on the street. We did some walking tours with different groups to identify existing challenges on the street. We also talked with safety and traffic personnel to understand operational needs on the corridor. We also gathered input at our open houses and from our online surveys. Additionally, we had some targeted one-on-one conversations with property owners and business owners along the corridor. And throughout the project, we received some very valuable input that ultimately informed our recommended design. The technical work that we did went hand in hand with engagement over the 2 years. We looked at things like trees along the corridor, utilities and encroachments, constraints for greening and stormwater infrastructure. And we identified where areaways were located. And areaways are basically basements of buildings that extend into the right-of-way under the sidewalks. And we learned that there are, in fact, many areaways on First Avenue. In addition to all of this, we also went out on event nights to observe traffic operations, things like where passenger pickup and drop-off happens and how pedestrians use the street. So after completing 3 phases of engagement and technical analysis, we then developed these 4 design alternatives for the corridor. And these images that you see on the right here might look familiar to some of you. We had shared them this past summer. We had two-way options, one with a bikeway and one without. And then we had 2 one-way options, again, one with a bikeway and one without. Now, all of these options aligned with city policies and plans. They incorporated operational considerations and technical analysis, and they were directly informed by previous engagement. All of these options also include wider sidewalks than today, and they support temporary closures for activation and events. I'll very quickly summarize here what we heard from that 3rd phase of engagement before turning this over to Luke. From the online survey, we heard more support for the options with a bikeway. In in-person conversations, we heard mixed feedback on the options with the bikeway, and we also heard preference for a one-way. Generally, however, we did not hear a strong consensus on whether a two-way or one-way option would best serve the project goals. And overall, what we heard at the end of phase 3 was pretty consistent with what we had heard from previous engagement as well. Which was that space for pedestrian and business activities like wider sidewalks and space for loading, drop-off, parking, space for outdoor dining and greening were top priorities. So if you'd like to take a deep dive into all of the engagement feedback we've heard to date, we have our engagement summaries available on the project webpage. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke, who will walk us through some key considerations that have informed the recommended design.
Well, thank you so much, Leoma. And again, good evening, everyone. My name is Luke Hansen, as noted, a senior transportation planner in Minneapolis Public Works. And I am project managing the preliminary design phase of the First Avenue reconstruction project. So as Leoma noted, this is a really exciting juncture and milestone for us. We have arrived at a recommended design concept, which we'll present on this evening. Ahead of that recommendation, however, I do want to establish some context that helped inform the design we'll ultimately be recommending, as well as some of the key considerations that went into our thinking behind that recommendation. So a little bit of recap, on First Avenue today, we have approximately 80 feet from building face to building face of public right-of-way. And as Leoma noted before, present in that public right-of-way are areaways which extend underneath the sidewalk and currently today are present throughout much of the corridor and have utilities on top of them. As we think through what takes up that 80 feet of space, I think there's also a determination that part of the design impetus for this project was improving the pedestrian environment and realm, and included there within our sidewalks that are wider than today, because we know that that's a pinch point. Other key space considerations also include travel and turn lanes, encroachments, whereas some of the existing buildings actually extend beyond the public right-of-way or the private right-of-way onto public right-of-way, and those are design features we need to work around, as well as new features of street design that didn't exist the last time First Avenue was reconstructed. That includes things like space for green stormwater infrastructure, which by ordinance we are required to treat stormwater on the corridor, in addition to other needs for operations, loading, drop-off, travel, and turn lanes, as we noted before. So back in phase 3, when we last engaged in summer, we explored, as Leoma noted, both one and two-way options for the street. In some very high-level context, part of the thinking here was not to turn first into a one-way. That was never a design goal or objective of the project. Instead, we explored one-way options because they didn't require as many turn lanes as a two-way street. As a result, that afforded some more space behind the curb that we could potentially appropriate for some of the other goals and objectives we were trying to accomplish with the redesign of First Avenue. And then at a really high level, we did do a traffic analysis that showed both one and two-way operations tend to function well on First. So as we weighed those considerations in phase 3, we reviewed the feedback we received as a project team and then performed some additional technical analysis to really tease out the impact of a one versus two-way roadway for motorized traffic on First. And I'll quickly summarize some key findings that were informative in terms of our ultimate thinking and recommendation for the corridor. So as I noted before, from an operational perspective, both one and two-way streets operate well, and that's not necessarily surprising. First used to operate as a one-way street, it stands to reason that it could function again. However, once we took a deeper dive and did some additional traffic analysis, by converting First to a one-way street, and as a recap, that would be a two-lane southbound one-way street, we found that approximately 1 to 200 vehicles per hour would be diverted northbound onto Hennepin. And that was a key consideration because, as we well appreciate, while our project limits are First Avenue from Washington to 8th and 9th Street on the south, First Avenue exists in a downtown network of streets and doesn't exist in a vacuum. And core to that consideration, too, was that diversion onto Hennepin, both in terms of traffic on the street, but also in terms of its ability to potentially impact northbound transit service. So those were key considerations. Additionally, at a high level, we weighed and vetted some of the safety options of both one and two-way streets. And broadly speaking, one-way streets sometimes have the potential for higher speeds or merging conflicts. Those merging conflicts are particularly where a car wants to merge from one lane to an adjacent lane, usually to complete a turn. Whereas sometimes the friction of a two-way street can help keep traffic speeds lower. Again, these are design and context specific, but at a high level, those were considerations we weighed as a project team with respect to safety. Additionally, we took a closer look at operations with a two-way street and found that at a high level, from the perspective of safety and adequate, acceptable traffic operations, turn lanes wouldn't necessarily be required at every intersection. That is helpful to know because if they're not required from the perspective of safety or necessary operations, that affords potentially some additional space we could put back behind the curb for other goals and objectives of the project. So an interesting and I think very informative operational finding. And then finally, I'll note cost is a consideration. Delivering this project within our schedule and budget is a clear objective. And some of the infrastructure changes required for a one-way street do increase the overall project cost. That isn't necessarily borne out within the project limits, but rather at the ends of the projects and intersecting streets, as we need to make striping and signal modifications to accommodate that one-way street. Ultimately, as we sat and synthesized the feedback and technical analysis as a project team, we came to the recommendation of advancing a two-way street for motorized traffic on First Avenue, and then did so with the thinking being that we can optimize turn lanes. And I think important to note, what does that mean? That means essentially based on our traffic analysis and safety considerations, there are locations where we do not need to maintain dedicated turn lanes at every intersection. The benefit there within being we are able to then appropriate that space behind the curb for additional pedestrian amenities, space, and other goals and objectives of the project. Similarly, going back to our phase 3 engagement that we last interfaced with in summer of this year, we also considered options both with and without bikeways. And at a really high level, just recapping years of engagement here, that is largely a function of having mixed results depending on who we were talking to through phases 1, 2, and 3 of engagement. Also at a high level, bikeways obviously take up space in the corridor, so there are impacts to what we're able to fit within the corridor, but then also there are existing bike facilities on First today. And part of that consideration was, just like traffic, how are bikeways considered within the overall downtown network of existing and proposed facilities? As we took a closer look at that as well, we considered not just First Avenue's, again, traffic implications, but how it sits in our connected and planned bikeway network. And part of that conversation is recognizing we do have a parallel all ages and abilities, which we call AAA, but all ages and abilities bike facility located on Hennepin Avenue that was installed when that street was recently reconstructed in both phases. As well as we look at bike facilities or connectivity to First, we also have intersecting bikeways at 10th, at 9th Street, which are soon to be improved with a federal project to make those safer, more comfortable, all ages and abilities facilities. And then bike facilities as well that intersect First on 6th, 4th, 3rd, and Washington. And then as we look at our planned network, over time, we do have the vision of connecting every intersecting street within project limits to First Avenue with bike facilities. So similar to our traffic considerations, following the completion of phase 3 engagement, we reviewed feedback and then explored design options both with and without bikeways to really assess how they best meet project goals on the corridor. At a high level, I'll note that one-way bikeways, protected bikeways on both sides of the street were not advanced, and that is largely just a function of they take up more space than a two-way bike facility and proved quite impactful. Similarly, as a result, we did explore a two-way sidewalk level bikeway on the east, which is the not target center side of First Avenue within project limits. As we sat and reviewed our design options, an important consideration was each option we explored and looked at included segments where that bikeway by necessity would have to be directly adjacent to the sidewalk. That would look quite similar to this image in the right on the slide, which is 4th Street, actually at First Avenue looking eastbound. And this wouldn't be contiguous throughout every part of the corridor, but on each block there would be segments where that bikeway by necessity would be required to be directly adjacent to the sidewalk. Like this image on 4th, what that does is limit our opportunity to include things like greening, some green stormwater infrastructure that's above grade, utilities, and some potential activation. And again, I'll note, it's not necessarily the full block, but many locations on every block in the corridor. An additional consideration too is, bikeways afford dedicated space for bikes, scooters, micromobility to operate. That is a good thing. That said, there's also a high likelihood of pedestrians inhabiting this space, most especially where that bikeway is directly adjacent to the sidewalk, again, similar to this image of 4th. I think that is also amplified when we're looking at event traffic, especially for pedestrians on First. And the images on the screen were taken this summer. As Leoma noted before, a really important component of our assessment of the corridor and as we're weighing project goals was to visit First at various times of day during various events so we could really understand how it's being used. And I think an important consideration is when we have a concert at First Ave or events at Target Center or Target Field, there are so many pedestrians, especially during event traffic. There is a high likelihood of pedestrians inhabiting that bikeway space, just given how many people we're talking about on this corridor. So ultimately, as we sat with those considerations and weighed them as a project team, we ultimately landed at a recommendation to not include a bike facility with a two-way street. That is largely a byproduct of are thinking that it limits our ability to deliver a pedestrian-focused street primarily because we are so space constrained, and as a result, we are not able to maintain trees, greening, activation, or green stormwater infrastructure along much of the corridor, and specifically at locations where that bikeway, like that image of Forest Street, is located directly adjacent to the sidewalk. That said, that's not a recommendation we make lightly. And I think the design objective of this project has to include continuing to support safe and practicable access for bikes to the many destinations along First. As a result, I think that comes with a necessary commitment to improving bikeway connections to First Avenue North. As I noted before at that bikeway network map, there are a number of existing bike facilities today, though I do think there's ample opportunity to make some targeted investments to those facilities to better support safe and practical access to the destinations along First and ensure that biking continues to be a safe and reasonable means of transportation to First. And then additionally, too, one benefit of being able to redesign First is the benefit of having functional boulevard space, which today is largely lacking along the corridor. With that, I think comes a really meaningful opportunity to explore bike parking along the corridor, which is pretty lacking today. And this is a determination that will be finalized through final design in 26 and 27. But things we're starting to explore now are where are those opportunities behind the curb for bike parking, again, appreciating that this can still support biking as a transportation option that is safe and meets our all ages and abilities expectations. And then also looking at potential opportunities for things like protected bike parking if we want to store bikes longer term. So ultimately, that leads us to our recommended design, which at a high level is a safer pedestrian-focused street. This includes much wider sidewalks than exist today. That is something we're really excited to be able to deliver, given that that is such an important component of First and is sorely lacking today. This also includes a design with dedicated boulevard space, which we also lack today, that then affords the opportunity for things like greening, utilities that aren't in the sidewalk like they are today, green stormwater infrastructure, the potential for trees, and also additional things like potential activation, or as I mentioned before, maybe opportunities for bike parking. This also results in a street where we can accommodate the necessary loading and drop-off needs along the corridor. And with a corridor that's as diverse as First, that includes things like Target Center, First Ave, also Butler Square, Fine Line, the loading and drop-off needs vary considerably from block to block. And as a result, we're able to arrive at a cross-section that meets those necessary loading drop-off needs, which are quite varied along the corridor. Additionally, this recommended design will continue to support events, street closures, outdoor dining and programming, but hopefully it does so in a way that it functions much better than today, especially because we're able to arrive at a design that substantially narrows the street and affords much more space behind the curb for programming. So again, at a design level, this recommendation includes two-way traffic on the street, though it is substantially narrower than today, and also should result in a traffic calmed, safer street for everyone using that facility. Again, it doesn't include a bikeway on the corridor itself, however, I think comes with a necessary commitment to improving connecting bike facilities to First, again, to support that as a meaningful and safe means of transportation along the corridor. So now to round out this portion of our presentation, we have a couple of just high-level conceptual images that show how this recommended design translates to the corridor today. These are just representative cross-sections, and important to note, this is largely communicating the different appropriation of space. This isn't final design. We still have years of design work to ultimately land at where all these features go. Though in this image at First and 3rd Street North, we can see we have a substantially narrower street with narrower crossing distances and hopefully a traffic calm street. What this affords is boulevard space where we can house utilities, infrastructure, trees, greening, and that doesn't have to compete for space with wider sidewalks as it does today. Another example here is the intersection of First and Fifth, where again, you can hopefully, at least in this image, see a very different cross-section communicated to the street. And then similarly to the intersection of 1st and 7th, where again, we're able to afford much more space behind the curb than exists today. One other interesting piece is these 2D images I feel like don't necessarily capture the magnitude of difference in terms of cross-section. So we also have a couple of GIFs, and I hope these work for us tonight. But more than anything, this is 1st Avenue at 5th Street looking northbound. And this isn't intended to communicate final design or aesthetics, but rather the difference in curb line and the appropriation of space with this recommendation. And I hope what is at least being communicated here is this is a substantially narrower street with much more space available for people walking, people rolling, other uses, activation behind the curb that just frankly isn't an option today. Here's another view looking southbound at 6th Street at Target Center. And again, as I kind of just let this GIF roll back and forth between the existing conditions and proposed, I hope what's being communicated is just how much additional space we're providing behind the curb. And at a location like 6th, that is critically important because we typically see pedestrian traffic, especially during events, spilling over into the street. So there is a clear demonstrated need to carve out more space for pedestrian queuing, especially during events. We're really excited to be able to deliver that with this recommendation. And then here is a third and I think final view of 1st Avenue between 6th and 5th Street, looking somewhat northbound. And again, just looking at a very narrowed, different cross-section than exists today with this recommendation. And then here is 3rd Street as well. So in summary, our recommendation is for a safer, pedestrian-focused 1st Avenue. That is a street that includes much wider sidewalks than we have today. A narrower, safer street, especially for people walking, that narrows crossing distances and should hopefully improve safety in a meaningful way. We have a street where we're able to carve out real boulevards to support infrastructure, including greening, green stormwater infrastructure, trees, utilities, light poles, bike parking, and then a design that continues to support the necessary operational needs of the corridor, which I mentioned before, depending on which block we're talking about, vary considerably. And then ultimately, this is a street that continues to accommodate events, potential programming or street closures, and then hopefully does so in a way that is better than today by virtue of a much more pedestrian-friendly and focused design. So right now, I'll note, before kind of talking through next steps, we're at the portion now where we're going to open the question and answer portion. So if you do have questions based on this presentation, you can find that Q&A button in the meeting here, and please submit your questions using that question and answer feature. So to quickly touch on some next steps for the project, we are kicking off our 4th and final phase of engagement right now. That's going to continue through December into January of next year. That includes a lot of individual stakeholder outreach and engagement, and then also includes finalizing our concept layout. I'll talk more about the draft concept layout in just a moment. That then tees us up for City Council layout approval, likely in February or March of 2026. And then that final design phase will follow in 26 and 27. And as noted before, this is a very complex, large street reconstruction project. It'll take us multiple years to develop those design plans. That's why you see that time appropriated, which then tees us up for construction starting in 2028 and likely continuing through into 2029. So that concludes our presentation for tonight. However, we do want to dedicate the remainder of time for any questions that we might be able to answer as a project team here. And as I noted before, we can share the questions in the Q&A feature. Another piece that I'll note is we also posted to the project website this morning our draft recommended concept layout that allows you to review on a kind of more specific block-by-block basis the concept layout we're proposing. I think important to note that this is a draft concept layout, so we anticipate engaging on this, and we are likely to make some changes to that before it is finalized and then adopted by City Council early next year. So just note, that's a concept layout showing our latest thinking, though we still intend to engage on that before finalizing that. And then, you're also welcome to share feedback on that concept layout on our feedback form, which is also posted in the project website. And I'm not sure how legible the red boxes are here, but we've kind of outlined in red both where that draft recommended concept layout is on our project website, as well as where that feedback form is as well. And then, as always, you can reach out to us individually with any other questions beyond tonight's open house as well. And as a project team, we're more than happy to respond in that matter as well. So with that, that concludes the presentation, and I think I can hand things over to my colleague here, Ella from Stantec, to start our question and answer portion of the presentation. So with that, Ella.
Excellent. Well, we will get that started on question and answers here. The first one that we have coming through is, how is this project being funded?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and this project is being funded by a variety of sources. As Leoma noted before, there is a $2 million federal grant, largely for pedestrian facilities in the corridor. That is a portion of it. This is a standard street reconstruction in Minneapolis, so there's also a standard special assessment that will help pay for that as well. And then other contributing funding sources include some net debt bonds, as well as metropolitan state aid funds that the city is applying for the reconstruction of the street as well. So that largely makes up the full $28 million project budget.
Excellent, thank you. All right, we are going to launch a second question here coming in from Sarah. All right, so our question is, have you measured if trucks can back into loading docks with the narrower lanes?
Yeah, so the question here is, have we measured, trucks backing into loading docks? And the answer at a high level is yes. However, the specific truck turning movements will continue to be refined through final design. So the concept layout that is posted to our website has accommodated truck turning movements. However, we still need to continue to refine that to ensure that loading docks as well as intersections continue to function the way they need to for truck operations. So I'll note, please feel free to offer feedback if there are any specific concerns, though that is also something we've looked at, what we need to continue to look at through final design to essentially confirm that we're meeting the needed operational needs along the corridor.
Excellent. All right. Third question, how much street parking is being removed with this design?
Sure. So I think important to note, especially at this stage, the draft concept layout that we have posted is just draft, and we anticipate making some changes to it. So it's premature to say exactly how much street parking is being removed. And another important consideration, too, is we're not drawing the distinction at this stage between loading, drop-off, other kind of signed operations, and formal street parking. That said, when we look at that existing layout today, I'd say we're maintaining approximately 60% of existing on-street parking. And that's an area where we anticipate engaging on over the next couple of months before finalizing that recommendation. And then one other consideration I do just want to flag with respect to street parking is there will have to be some reduction no matter what because of the realities of designing for a modern roadway and the requirements we need to accommodate to do so. And specifically, there are things like ADA compliant pedestrian ramps, bump outs at intersections, which have a really meaningful safety benefit, as well as space for things like utilities, green stormwater infrastructure, avoiding areaways. Those all ultimately result at a different looking street than exists today. And I just wanted to shine a little bit of light on to those items because those all influence and inform where we're able to maintain either on-street parking or I'd say loading or drop-off operations along the corridor.
Thanks, Luke. All right, next up, we have a question from David. What is the feedback for street traffic on First Ave, specifically around Target Center and First Avenue congestion during events?
Sure. So we've received a variety of feedback, especially during event traffic. And I think some important considerations here is the design that we're proposing continues to function well for existing traffic on First. That said, when traffic is especially heavy, we are also anticipating traffic control agents or TCAs continuing to have a presence on the corridor. What that is reflecting is the amount of traffic that we tend to see with those events. So at broad strokes, we think we're going to result in a safer, better functioning street, but one that, still relies on traffic control agents, especially when event traffic is particularly high, just given how much those vehicle volumes increase over traditional non-event day traffic.
Great. All right. Next question. What consideration has been given for valet parking?
Sure. So we've had a number of discussions with stakeholders along the corridor. I'll very much note that valet parking has been a conversation we've had frequently, depending on which stakeholder and which block. At this stage, it's premature to say, where those valet zones could go. And more than anything, I think our objective was to understand what the existing use and need was. Over the next, couple of months, we'll continue to have those conversations to basically confirm even if this is an existing operation, is this one that we anticipate continuing into the future? And then importantly, I'll note those final signing recommendations for either off-street parking, loading, drop-off, or valet services will be made through the final design process. So we're going to bring a recommended concept layout that shows curb lines to City Council, but we're not going to specify whether that's valet or whether that's loading or drop-off or on-street parking. And instead, those will be determinations that are confirmed through final design. And that is largely a function of how specific those are and some of the final design pieces in terms of infrastructure and geometry we're going to need to confirm further down the road.
Awesome. All right. And then we have, what is the special assessment area?
So the special assessment area is essentially project limits, as happens with a traditional street reconstruction project. I can direct you to our special assessment website on the City of Minneapolis webpage. That's something we can even link to on our project page. And it shows how those special assessment areas and zones are determined. It gets fairly complex, so I'll keep it relatively high level here today. Though I think an important consideration here is this will be a traditional special assessment zone. It will not look something more like Nicollet or other things that we've done in the past.
Okay, and that is all of the questions that we've received at this time. If folks would like to offer up any others, feel free, but that is what we have in our queue.
Well, as we wait maybe for some final questions, I'll just note we really appreciate everybody making the time to attend tonight. As we noted before, this is an opportunity to share some information, but is really just the beginning of our fourth and final phase of engagement. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Leoma, Membera, or myself on any of the information presented on tonight. And as noted before, this is just kicking off our fourth phase engagement. We anticipate continuing to meet with stakeholders individually and engage on this project into 2026. And again, just really want to reiterate, we very much appreciate your time and don't take that for granted. So thank you all so much for attending this evening.
And we've got one more that's come in here, Luke, that I'll put up. There seems to be significant attention towards pedestrians. Why is this? What do you hope to gain from this?
Sure. So, as this project was being scoped, I think there were two compelling and very important needs that we're looking to address. And this goes years back. One of which is we have degraded infrastructure on First Avenue that has passed its useful life and would fail. So we need to program a street reconstruction project to address our infrastructure needs. That said, one of the other, and I'd say parallel pillars of rationale for this project was improving First Avenue for people walking. And the assumption there is it doesn't do a great job today of meeting that need. And if we look in the corridor, I'd say this very unfortunately, First Avenue does show up in our high injury network of streets in Minneapolis. And that's essentially streets that make up only 9% of our city street system and grid. They'll record 66% of our severe and fatal crashes. That is a demonstrated and frankly unacceptable crash history that we are looking to address head on with this project. Additionally, there are some practical considerations as well. And for anyone who's walked next to Target Center or down the street during events, I don't think it's a surprise to say you are very space constrained in terms of infrastructure and your ability to operate. And then during event traffic as well, it is very typical for there to be so many pedestrians at corners, especially an intersection like 1st and 7th or 1st and 6th or 5th, that pedestrians often don't have enough space behind the curb to queue and end up being in the street, which is dangerous as well. So all of that just to say there's cascading both design and safety impetus to better support a functional pedestrian environment on First, and is something that we prioritized in our thinking as a project team, reflected in the design presented tonight. Great. If there are no further questions, again, really appreciate everybody's time and attendance tonight. And we will continue to be in touch as a project team. So thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.